Um, anyone that has a rental subsidy or living in a tax credit unit, all of those units have to meet HQS compliance. If the tenant doesn't have a rental subsidy or is not living in a tax credit unit, the HQS doesn't really apply. And we'll talk about what other sorts of inspections a tenant could utilize if they don't have a rental subsidy from a housing authority or a tax credit property, or if they're not in the TCL program. So I just want to preface that this is only about housing quality standards, the HUD protocol. So I'm just going to toss it over to Natalie, and she's going to get us started.
Okay, thanks. I'm going to talk a little bit about what you need to pass an inspection. Now, what you need to understand is there's always an initial inspection, and that is before the person moves in. With targeted units and housing authorities, they do their own, all these subsidized places, but sometimes, especially with TCLI, even if it is private, Alex has to, we have people contracted with us to do inspections, and he does have to have them do an inspection on that initial, even if it's private, and that's with TCLI people. And then we do, for the private ones, it's every other year, Alex, is it?
No. So HQS inspections are going to occur before somebody moves in. So right. Nobody should move into a unit before it's passed the inspection. And then there's an annual inspection. I will say though, it's every year, but, and there are other inspections that can occur outside of those requirements. But I want to just clarify that right now, because of the pandemic, for TCL, annual inspections have been suspended because of the risks and dangers associated with, COVID and exposing folks to COVID.
Right. So we're still doing the ones before they move in because no one's in there. But the annual ones, once they've moved in, we're not doing those anymore. So just to give you a little bit background on me, I started doing inspections, well, honestly, if I were to go way back, it would be when I worked as a foster care consultant. I had to license foster homes. I had to do what they call home studies. And those inspections were much more in depth than what we're talking about here, because we're talking about kids living in a safe environment. But then from there, I worked with Rapid Rehousing Program, which requires inspections to be done on units. And then I worked for the city of Raleigh, where I did inspect a lot of targeted units and tax credit units. Probably if I had to say how many I did a year, it'd be probably about 200 a year inspections. So anyway, one of the things that we're going to go over is what's required. So a lot of times I'll go and do an inspection on a house, and someone will show me something that they call a bedroom. The bedroom, every bedroom, or what's identified as a bedroom, has to have a window and a closet. Now, a lot of people will show me a room and they'll say this is a bedroom. If there's no closet in there, it's not a bedroom. It has to have a closet, and of course it has to have a window. There has to be 2 outlets in there, or 1 outlet and a permanent light fixture. So if there's only 1 outlet, but in the ceiling, there's a light that you can flip a switch, then that's fine. Every unit has to have something you can easily identify as a living room, bedroom, kitchen, and bathroom. The living space has to have 2 forms of egress, and that's for safety reasons, of course. You got to be able to get in and out more than one way. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that later and why that's so important. Oftentimes I would go to do inspections and the windows would be cracked, or I can't open them. And some people, I will say, maybe they don't open every window, but I'm kind of anal. So whenever I did an inspection, I opened every single window. If I couldn't open it and close it, then it wouldn't pass inspection. If it didn't lock, it wouldn't pass inspection. So these are some of the things that, why things might fail. All exterior doors lock properly. We do have a private landlords who might be a little slack sometime, and the lock is so wobbly that you could probably push it in with your shoulder, the door. So that wouldn't pass. It has to be a tight lock. And there can't be any peeling paint. Now, there are rules about peeling paint. If the unit was built before 1978 and there are children in the house under the age of 6, then there has to be some kind of documentation that there's no lead paint in that unit.
Excuse
Did I
me,
miss
Natalie.
anything about that part, Alex?
Mr. Gregory Mosley has a question.
Yes.
I have clients who have TCLI housing, and they live in an apartment building, and some of them live on the second and third floors, and their apartments like has one door. And so how do you qualify or disqualify that?
No, well, when I talked about the egress, but each bedroom has a window, correct? Each bedroom has a window and each bedroom has a door to go into the bedroom. So
Yes.
that's how that works.
Okay.
Does that answer your question?
Kind of. I mean,
Well, I
suppose
wanna
they have to
make
get
sure-
out of the apartment in an emergency.
They
And
can go
therefore
through.
this-
They can go through one of the windows. Now, and another reason about inspections, by the way, and you don't usually have this problem with tax credit apartments, is even on the outside, there has to be so many feet of clearance from the building to and on the lawn. And that's so emergency vehicles can get around, and that's so a person can exit through a window if they had to.
Okay.
Okay? So that's another thing what we inspect is they can't have old cars parked up against the building or things like that that would block the way for an emergency vehicle, whether it's a fire truck, an ambulance, or whatever, to get around there. Okay? Oh, next one, Alex, please.
Sure.
For electrical, all the light fixtures and the switches must work. And I want to say something about this because this is a biggie, especially with private units. And we do have a lot of people living in private units. An inspection cannot be done if the electricity is not on. There's no way we can do an inspection. And even if the landlord will say, well, they'll have to do it without it, we have to have the electrical on in order to do the inspection. And you may not want to feel heat, turn on the heat when it's 90 degrees outside, but you got to turn on the heat. You may not want to feel the air when it's like today, but we have to turn on the air. We have to make sure it works. We have to make sure that the breaker box is covered and nothing's going to bother it. And that there has to be a smoke detector on every floor. And when I say every floor, I don't mean like in the basement, but every floor that someone's living on. So if there's an upstairs, downstairs, there has to be a smoke detector upstairs, usually in the hallway. And then there has to be a smoke detector downstairs, and they both have to work. So we usually use a long pole and just tap it to make sure that it's working. Another thing I want to touch on, because it's a huge misconception, especially with us living in the South, that every unit has to have heat. It has to have working heat in it. Every unit does not have to have air conditioning. Now, if there's air conditioning unit in there when the person moves in, it has to work. If there is no air conditioning in a unit that a person moves in there, the landlord is not obligated to put air conditioning in the unit. Okay, any questions about that? So with the structures, the walls and everything, you can't have cracks, you can't have leaks. I've gone into units where literally, and I know I'm no small person, but even still, I should be able to walk on the floor without it sinking. I've walked into units where literally, when you take a step, the floor sinks. What do you think that's a sign of when you see that? Anybody can answer. What do you think that's a sign of?
That's a structural problem.
It's a structural problem. And what do you think it's from?
Rotten boards in the floor.
It's a lot of, because of the rotten boards, dampness. There may have been a flood in that area. Something may
It
have
could be termites.
termites. Very good. Yeah.
Foundation,
I'm sorry?
foundation.
Yep. The foundation could be cracking for all kinds of reasons. So those were all good reasons. Thanks, you guys. So you want to check for that. A floor shouldn't have any bounce and give to it. Handrails, they must be present and secure. I do believe in Alex, I don't know, maybe you can help me with this. If there are 4 or more steps, there has to be a handrail. So you can have 3 steps. Is it 4? Is that correct? 4 or more steps.
I think that's
there has
right.
to be a handrail.
It's actually 30, yeah, it's 36 inches. If it's
okay, thank you.
36 inches, yeah.
And it doesn't have to be on both sides, but you do have to have at least one handrail. Unit has to be free of infestation. We're going to talk a little bit more about that later. But when you go into a unit and you can clearly see bugs that are actually moving around and everything, if the landlord says, well, that's because, you know, you see so many because we just had it treated, you can ask for documentation. Show me the documentation. Because when a unit is treated, even for bed bugs or whatever, the landlord cannot do it themselves. It has to be by a licensed exterminator. There has to be documentation that it was done by a licensed exterminator, because anybody can just go in there and spray Raid, but that's not sufficient. The bathroom has to have either one window or a ceiling fan. So there has to be ventilation in the bathroom. And when you go look at units, if you ever get to do that for your members or your clients, just turn on that ceiling fan. I can't tell you how many times that ventilation fan up there, I can't tell you how many times I've turned them on and they don't work. So make sure you do that, please. Next one, thanks. So these are some of the main reasons things fail, and some of them are easy fixes. I will say that whenever inspections are done, which they're now on hold, but with the annual inspections, usually when those are done, the property manager and the maintenance guy accompanies the inspector. And they do that so that they can fix easy things, like say for instance, smoke detector's not working. Well, right there, during the inspection, the maintenance guy will, you know, make sure there's another battery or whatever. So that's easy fix. Cracked or broken window panes, not so easy. It will fail inspection, and then they have to show us evidence, like a receipt from a repair, that it was actually corrected. This is a big one, furniture blocking the doors or the windows. And when I say that, I mean, you don't put a bookcase in front of a window, because remember we just talked about you got to have 2 forms of egress. Another thing they can't do, and I've seen this lots and lots of times, is people who are like hoarders or semi-hoarders. You ever go into a house and you can't open the door all the way? You can barely fit through? That's going to fail inspection. There can't be so much stuff piled up in that room that you can't open that door all the way. Okay, any questions about anything so far? Another one is inoperable missing electric stove burners. Now, we do have to turn on every burner. And what I usually do is I just turn on every burner, put my hand over each burner. I have to turn on the oven. I open the oven. There cannot be aluminum foil in those burners. That's a fire hazard. There can't be aluminum foil in the stove, fire hazard, in the oven. So all those are fire hazards. I know people are used to doing it, but it's not allowed in these subsidized units. The leak, we have to turn on all the faucets. We have to flush all the toilets. We have to do all of that. Another electrical issue that it's easy fix though, there can't be a socket, a light socket without a bulb in it. So there can't be an open socket. Even if that bulb's not working, there has to be a bulb in there. No one should be able to stick their finger or anything into a socket. That might seem simple to you guys, but that would fail. The inspection would fail if they don't fix it immediately. And then again, the infestation. So you guys tell me, you can do it in the chat. Would this unit pass inspection? Why or why not? Anybody answering? Someone said no. Why would it not pass inspection? Don't see a closet. Well, we don't see the whole room, but let's just assume there's a closet in there.
I think it would pass. I think it's just dirty, but it would pass.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it is kind of messy. It looks like the room of a teenager, and it would pass. It wouldn't pass for me. My kids, I know they better not have their room like that. But even the window, you see there's stuff there, but there's no furniture blocking that window. Now,
I thought
if I,
I thought
if
that
I,
was I thought that was a dresser or something
well,
over there by the window.
it is, it is, but let me tell you, it's
It
the
looks like it's
level-
built into the, it's
Yeah.
built into the wall.
and
And
even
it's
if
not blocking the window.
it's not blocking the window. That's what I'm saying. It meets the ledge of the window. If it
Oh,
meets
okay.
the ledge of the window, it's not blocking the window. A firefighter could still lift that window and climb right in there. Or
Okay.
someone can lift the window and climb right out. So it's not like you have to move a heavy piece of furniture. Okay?
Okay.
All right.
I couldn't tell if it was stationary or not.
Yeah, even if it wasn't, whether or not it was. How about this one?
No.
No,
Okay, why not?
No,
the bed is
'cause it's
blocking the window.
Yeah, but it's very neat, isn't it?
Yeah.
You're right. Okay, so you are correct. It would not, Alex, if you hit the thing again, I think it'll show the reason. If you hit, yeah, even though it's tidy, the bed is right in front of the window. Good luck moving that. But again, easy fix. Take the headboard off or put the bed on and switch it to the other wall where those pictures are hanging, right? Okay, next one. I know we're moving kind of fast, but we don't want to, we want to keep in the time frame, and Alex has a lot of good information to share. So one of the biggest violations we get, and this is usually after a person moves in, are about bed bugs. So here you see the little cartoon that, yeah, the bed bugs are all into your clothes because they will get into everything. There are laws now. There didn't used to be laws, but there are laws now about bed bugs. There is a common assumption that if there are bed bugs, it's the landlord's responsibility. Yes and no, okay? They have to make sure when you move in there that it's free of infestation. So that's why we check it. So they usually will do that. They'll have a certificate or something by a licensed pest control company, okay, saying that it's free of infestation. Now, if you move in there, Alex, you can keep going. If you move in there and you see that within 60 days of renting, that there's bugs in there, the landlord he's responsible for it, okay? I mean, sorry, the tenant, you're responsible because he told you it was free of infestation. But if you move in there and within 60 days you see bugs, there's the assumption that you had to bring them with you because he gave you that certificate of, from the pest control that we inspected it, it's been treated, there's no bugs, okay? You have to put in writing, if it's after that 60 days, you have to put in writing or within that 60-day period that there are bed bugs, and you only have 5 days to do that. So if you see bed bugs and you tell, and the member will tell the provider, oh, I saw bed bugs. Here it is Monday. I saw bed bugs. And then 10 days later, excuse me, you're complaining still, but you didn't put anything in writing to the landlord. He's not going to be responsible. You got to put it in writing. Make sure that tenants know. And not just with bed bugs, you guys, any complaints should be in writing because you all know if it's not written down, it didn't happen. Okay, next slide, please, Alex. So if the landlord receives a certification, again, it's the tenant's responsibility to exterminate the unit within 7 days of notifying the landlord. Again, you must have brought them with you because it was clear when it came. If the tenants don't take action, the landlord will still go ahead and do whatever he has to do to exterminate, but he's going to charge it to the tenant. Now, the average cost of bed bug treatment is anywhere from $400 to $800. And here's the worst part. If it is discovered that the adjacent unit has bed bugs, which came from your unit, you're responsible for the cost of extermination of the adjacent units. You can't, and if it's not your fault, if there are bed bugs and it's not your fault, you can't stop paying rent because the landlord's taking his sweet time to exterminate. Alex will talk to you more about other remedies for that. Unless you have a court order, under no circumstances can any tenant legally stop paying rent for any reason whatsoever. Any questions about any of this? Okay, great.
Okay, so one of the things that I think is very helpful to when you're looking at units with a member, and we'll call them the prospective tenant. So when you're looking at units with a prospective tenant, I think it would be really helpful to kind of access some of the HUD habitability checklists that are available online, going to HUD's website. This is just, I think, a good way to kind of keep some of these things in mind as you're looking at units, whether you are able to see them in person or do that virtually. I would highly recommend that even now during COVID, if you can't look at a unit in person, I mean, I think it's always important that a prospective tenant gets to see the unit that they're interested in, regardless. If you can't see that unit in person, you should be able to request to do some sort of virtual walkthrough of that unit. And so, if you're able to do that and, look at one of these checklists as you're kind of, sussing out, prospective units, that could be a really helpful way to just kind of keep these things in mind, so you're not trying to remember it all at once. So you can check out, HUD's website on HQS inspections. There are also other HUD inspection protocols as well, but HQS and the habitability are going to be pretty much the same, and look at sort of the basic, HQS overall is looking at sort of basic standards of health and safety that need to be, in a unit.
Yeah, so Alex, I just want to make it really clear that there really are two levels of inspection. So you have he just stated the HQS, which is that bigger inspection that has to be done for anybody with a subsidy. But you as a provider, you can just use the checklist, which is a lower level, but anybody can do it. So it's a very helpful tool. So there's actually two that you could use, or there are two different levels of inspection.
Yep. Okay, so what happens when a unit fails an inspection, right? Now, it's a lot easier to kind of address this at the move-in, right? When no one's living in the unit, right? So if a unit fails, I can speak at least in the TCL program, if a unit fails at the move-in inspection, we allow that landlord, an additional opportunity to fix whatever needs to be fixed. So that so when a unit fails inspection at the move-in event, that's fairly easy to kind of resolve and fix. Gets a lot more complicated when somebody's been living in a unit and we get around to doing an annual inspection. Now, I did mention that for now, in the TCL program, annual inspections have been suspended because of the COVID pandemic. That does not mean, though, that you cannot request either a special inspection, an emergency inspection, and we'll talk a little bit about that. So what happens when a unit fails? There are kind of a couple of different categories that this could fall into. The first one being an emergency fail. And I won't read this whole thing for you. You all can look at it and read it yourselves. But basically, an emergency fail is going to be when something in the unit is not working and it's posing an immediate health and safety risk to the individual, right? So utilities don't work, there's a potential gas leak, etc. If the unit fails, right, and say, for example, in the TCL program, or say in Targeted Key, or if you have a voucher from Housing Authority and the Housing Authority is performing the inspection, or one of our contracted inspectors goes out and they fail it and they claim that it's an emergency fail, the landlord is on a time frame to fix these things. So depending on how serious, it could be anywhere from 24 hours to 72 hours. For the landlord to rectify and fix those things. So that's an emergency fail. Now, usually when this sort of thing occurs, again, it's because either we've been notified by a provider or the member themselves that, hey, my heat is not working anymore. I've told the landlord, and Natalie and I will kind of harp on this again and again today. It's really, really critical that if you suspect that there is a major issue in the unit, please make sure that the tenant knows how to document and notify the landlord properly, right? So everybody's lease should have some section in it that discloses about the way in which a tenant needs to notify their landlord about maintenance issues, repair issues, etc. So again, like Natalie said, if it's not in writing, it becomes a lot harder to, when we get to the point of figuring out, well, what caused this? Was it the tenant? Was it landlord neglect, etc.? Was it just, total accident? If all along the way the tenant has been documenting and notifying their landlord in writing, that's going to make their case a lot stronger than if they hadn't done that. Okay. Now, sometimes, in an emergency, maybe you don't have the time to do that. But I still think, regardless of the time frame, please make sure you're assisting the tenant in getting this stuff in writing. Okay, so that's an emergency fail. The next one. Okay, so like I said, sorry, the failure consequences. So depending on the severity, the landlord might have 24 hours to rectify this issue, and then the inspector will come back out to verify that it's been fixed, and so both, if it's done by us, if it's TCL, both Alliance and the inspector will notify in writing the landlord, the owner, like, hey, these are the things that you need to fix. And this goes for all the failing, depending on what kind of a failing inspection it is. But, and again, specifically with TCL and a PHA, a Public Housing Authority voucher, if the landlord fails to correct those issues within the certain time frame, it'll result in suspension of the HAP contract, or the Housing Assistance Payment contract, that either the Housing Authority or Alliance has with that landlord. So essentially, if they don't fix that in enough time, the HAP payments will be suspended. And we'll talk a little bit more about kind of consequences at the end.
Alex, can you
Yeah.
define what constitutes an emergency?
Right. So here, right. So this
Right.
something is it's posing a danger to health and safety, right? So let's say there's no running water, there's no electricity, there's no heat, or there's a potential gas leak or flooding or a sewage leak. Those are things that are posing an immediate health and safety risk to the individual. Or this unit has become uninhabitable because of a fire, flood, destroyed through vandalism, etc. Right? And the tenant can't reasonably use the kitchen, the bathroom, right? Okay. The second tier, just below emergency, would be a major fail. Okay. Now this could be either for a unit having multiple sort of quote unquote minor failing items, right? So let's say you have a couple of things like, okay, there's no working stove burners, the oven doesn't work, there is a broken window, the loose handrail. Each individual failing item might not be critical and major or life-threatening, health and safety threatening, but if you add them all up together, it constitutes a major fail. And oftentimes we'll see these when units fail, more often than not, it's because there are a number of items that have been neglected. And, then I think we can also talk about this towards the end. What do we do to kind of resolve some of these issues? Because I think oftentimes we'll see sort of a recurrence of these sorts of things. And again, so anytime a unit fails, then the inspector and or the agency that is paying for that inspection is going to notify the landlord in writing. We always give them the inspection report showing, hey, there was this broken window in the bathroom. There's a missing handrail to the steps outside, blah, blah, blah. And then they're usually given 10 days to fix those items. And again, because each individual minor fail is not necessarily a health and safety risk, that That's why the landlord has more time. So yeah, and so this is just, again, reiterating the consequences of a major fail. And if at the time that the inspector goes back to recheck that these items have still failed, that's then again when it would trigger suspension of the HAP contract or the subsidy payment. And again, if we're at the point where this unit is failing 2 or 3 times, depending on the agency's policies and protocols, it may mean that, you know, this particular unit is going to be considered, you know, voided from the program, removed from the program. You just, you know, this landlord is basically just in violation of the HAP contract, which stipulates that, you know, the unit has to be in compliance with HQS. Now, I will say, at least in TCL, that's really only ever occurred one time, to my knowledge, where we've actually had to basically, you know, we had a landlord who just would not get a unit into compliance, and we had to terminate that HAP contract. And then the last one, this is sort of the most minor, right? These are minor fails. This is where, you know, again, it's something simple like, okay, the smoke detectors are missing batteries. That's a very minor fix. And I see that there's a question about what happens with the HAP contract is terminated. So we'll talk about that at the end. And sorry, whoops. If, you know, there's a minor failing item, we generally give the landlord 14 days. Usually doesn't take 14 days, but, you know, they do have that time frame. And again, I see another question: would the HAP agreement be suspended if the failure is due to the tenant? Yes, so that is also a consequence, and that's actually the next slide. So this is kind of where we get into a gray zone and some muddy waters when it comes to inspections. So what happens if a tenant has caused the inspection to fail? Well, the HQS inspection process and the protocols are going to be the same, regardless of who's at fault, whether it's an act of God, AKA, you know, it just happened, versus landlord neglect, or tenant, the tenant has done something, damaged the unit, or not reported an issue. Now, that's an important one to keep in mind, because this does happen where a tenant has not damaged something, but something is not working in the unit and they don't report it, and it escalates and gets worse. They'll still be held liable for that, because you're responsible. In your lease, it will state that the tenant is responsible for reporting maintenance issues or repair issues, or if something's not working, you need to report that to your landlord, right? Regardless of whether or not you caused it as the tenant or it just happened. So if a tenant is not notifying a landlord, they can be held liable for this stuff. And again, if it's not in writing, it ends up being sort of a he said, she said tenant landlord dispute. Okay. So
Alex, can I just say one thing about this? Because in the beginning, when Alex mentioned that we're talking, you know, the HQS inspections apply primarily to tax credit and targeted units. As a provider, you can support the tenant as much as you can, help them write up complaints or document them. But as far as going directly to the property manager, that's something that the state prefers you not do. If you don't already know that, you need to go through Alliance for that type of issue. And what we'll do, and that we, meaning me, usually if you contacted me or even Alex, either one of us, we'll contact the state and we'll let you know, we'll let them know what's going on.
Right.
And so the state is like the liaison with the property manager and any tenant issues that can't be resolved between the tenant and the property manager themselves. But we ask that as the provider, you do not go directly to the property manager. There's lots of reasons for that, but the major one is for confidentiality and not disclosing any PHI and things like that. Property managers are not mental health providers. They don't know.
But just to reiterate, that is only for targeted key tax credit property. So
Exactly.
if you have an individual who's living in the private rental market and they have TCLV, then you need to report this directly to the landlord, right? So all of that needs to be in writing. And based on the person's lease, it doesn't matter if they're in a targeted unit, TCLV, or even if they don't have a rental subsidy at all, any sort of repair, maintenance, damage, that everybody's lease is going to say you need to report that information in writing to the landlord. So please make sure that you're doing that regardless.
And if
Okay.
you don't know the difference between what we're saying about between the targeted and the private landlords, we will be having more trainings that kind of describe out what those different pathways are of housing. So it's important to know what kind of housing your person's in.
Okay, so
if my client lives in housing authority and she has a leaky ceiling, do I report that to Alliance?
no, right. So I mean, you can always, if they're an Alliance member, you can always report that to Alliance. But for example, if you have somebody who's not in TCL and they are living in subsidized housing, either through the housing authority, then the housing authority needs to know that, right? So the agency that is paying for that subsidized unit, they need to be informed, right? So if you have somebody that's living in traditional public housing where the unit itself has a subsidy, not the tenant, then the housing authority needs to know that. If you have somebody that has a Section 8 voucher or a housing choice voucher, the tenant needs to report any sort of damage, regardless of who's at fault. They need to report that in writing to their landlord, and they should notify the housing authority, because the housing authority will be the one that does the inspection, right? If somebody's in TCL and they're in a targeted key unit, again, the tenant should follow the terms of their lease, and if they're not sure, look at the tenant's lease and see what it says about reporting damages, etc. Right? They should still be giving that information to their landlord in writing, and then contact Alliance, and then etc. etc. So it should be universal that anytime there's some sort of maintenance issue, repair issue, or damage to a unit, again, regardless of who's at fault for it, in the long run, it's best that the tenant reports that in writing so that you have proof that you notified the landlord, which then puts the ball in the landlord's court for them to act and do what's appropriate. Now, again, if it's tenant caused damage, I would argue that in the long run, it's still better for a tenant to notify their landlord and say, hey, like, I might have damaged this thing in the unit. I'm letting you know, because that shows, one, to the landlord that you're a responsible person and that you take the terms of your lease seriously, right? You're not going to get evicted for that. Now, it depends on the severity. You know, let's say we've had an individual who just completely tore apart their unit. Well, you'll have to deal with the consequences of breaking the terms of your lease. But my point is, it is much better to report sort of normal damage, repair, maintenance issues directly to your landlord right away, rather than not telling them, letting the condition of the issue get worse, because we've seen this happen as well, where something started out as a minor damage that the tenant may or may not have caused, but they don't report it. The provider doesn't notify Alliance or the agency that is, you know, paying the rental subsidy. The condition of that damage ends up getting worse, and then at that point, once the landlord gets wind of it, they're generally speaking less likely to be accommodating to that tenant if they believe the tenant has caused that damage. Okay, so
I'm sorry. I just wanted to say one thing about what you touched. I just want to touch on the fact that if a tenant did cause the damage, please, like Alex said, report it. Do not attempt to fix it yourself or have your uncle or someone else come in and fix
Yeah,
it,
do not
because
do that.
again, you're talking about making things worse. And these property managers, these companies, they are contracted with licensed people to come and fix. That's a requirement. There has
Right,
to be a
'cause-
licensed person to come in and fix
Right.
those things, right, Alex?
Because they haven't, right, exactly. And this, again, this applies for any tenant, regardless of where you're
Right.
living and renting. A landlord, it's their job, they're legally responsible for completing those repairs, right? So yeah, that's a very good point. Don't try to, do these repairs yourself or hire somebody else to do it. And if it is tenant caused damage, and that is what the landlord, deems, then the tenant may have to enter into a payment plan to pay off those repairs. That very well may happen. But again, I think in the long run, it's better to be upfront and notify the landlord correctly by the terms of your lease than to not report it, and then in the long run, it gets a lot worse and it kind of escalates into a landlord-tenant dispute in a way that it didn't need to get. So we're kind of getting towards the end, and I want to kind of wrap this up so we can have some Q&A time. So let's say you have a tenant, you're working with a member who doesn't have a rental subsidy, not living in a tax credit property. So there's no HQS protocol that's being implemented. What do you do? Okay, so again, most landlords, when you move into a unit, are going to provide you with some sort of checklist, right? So you can assess for yourself, okay, I'm taking possession of this unit. I go through this checklist. And if you notice that things don't look right or amiss, that's when you go back and forth with the landlord to say, hey, like I moved in here and I see that you clearly did some sort of extermination and there's still all these dead bugs left in the unit. Like, that's your opportunity at move-in to kind of go back and forth with them informally about making sure the unit is in good condition. But let's say over the course of the tenancy, there are issues, there are concerns, and you don't have access to the HQS inspection because you don't have a voucher from a housing authority, you're not living in a tax credit property, or you're not in TCL. What do you do? Okay, well, you can contact code enforcement through the local, whatever municipality that the tenant is residing in. That county, that municipality will have their own code enforcement division. I know, for example, in Durham, it's in their neighborhood improvement services department. And so this is where, any renter in the United States can request a code enforcement inspection of their unit. If they feel that there's a health and safety issue occurring, and code enforcement will come out and they will do their own assessment, do their own inspection, and then make a determination as to whether or not, does this violate health and safety and who's responsible. And so this is often, and I would also suggest that code enforcement can be a useful tool for a tenant, even if they have a rental subsidy, and because not all issues are going to be either seen or caught or rectified via an HQS inspection. So what I mean is landlord-tenant disputes may be resolved using an HQS inspection if it's a quite obvious sort of thing that needs to be fixed. But if you have, or you suspect that there are other bigger issues like something's wrong with the foundation or the electrical wiring, you can still go to code enforcement to get them to investigate. So this is a useful tool for any renter, but especially for somebody, if you don't have a rental subsidy and there isn't an HQS protocol, you can still contact code enforcement. And so, every municipality does this. You'll have to look at the individual, county municipality websites to see what division they put code enforcement in. But there are minimum housing standards that every landlord, regardless of whether or not it's quote unquote affordable housing, has to abide by. And so a couple of things that we just want to touch on here at the end. One of the things I kind of want to talk about is, okay, what happens if that HAP contract, either, you know, the Housing Authority's HAP contract or Alliance's HAP contract, has to be suspended because of the inspection, failing inspection? Well, the tenant still has a legal lease, right? They still have if they still are within the terms of their lease, they're still going to be required to pay their rent. So while the inspection process is, I think, a really, if you can use it in a way to be proactive about a tenant's unit, to help that tenant either better understand the terms of their lease, about how to keep their unit in good condition, it can be a really helpful intervention in terms of tenancy support. But it's not, the HQS inspection itself is not always the remedy for a landlord-tenant dispute. And I will say that in the state of North Carolina, when it comes to landlord-tenant disputes, the courts are generally going to be leaning in favor of the landlord. That's just generally how it is across this country, and especially in some states like North Carolina. So please keep that in mind, that in HQS inspection, you know, if it turns out that something gets failed and we fail it, and usually I would say, you know, 9 out of 10 times that landlord will do what they need to do to get it into compliance. But if it gets to a point where it's no longer in compliance and we suspend the HAP contract, that does not mean that the tenant is then out of their lease. They still have a lease, right? That's the legal binding document that they have with their landlord. So just keep that in mind as well, that the HQS inspection protocol is not always a replacement for resolving landlord-tenant disputes. And again, please make sure that the tenant is getting everything in writing, you know. So I just wanted to kind of throw that in there, that you know, it's still important that the tenant is abiding by the terms of their lease, and that they understand the terms of their lease as well. Natalie, is there anything else, any sort of final pieces you want to add before we get to any questions?
No, I did see on one of your slides, you talked about abatement, and that reminded me of a case that I had where I had a client who was living in a Section 8 house, the Housing Authority Section 8 house. Well, the state said, you know, they came in, code enforcement came in and deemed that it was not habitable, and so many things had to get fixed. So the tenant was living with, I guess, a friend or a family member or something while these things were getting fixed, and they weren't obligated to pay their rent. They weren't there. And Section 8, the Housing Authority, they weren't paying their portion of the rent either, because that unit was what we call an abatement. No one could live there until these items were fixed. Well, everything got fixed. The tenant moved back in, and they showed me a bill they got from the landlord trying to charge them their portion of the rent and the portion that the Housing Authority would have normally paid. So we had to kind of get legal aid involved and everything, because they were trying to charge them thousands of dollars, because they were out of the house, I think, for like a month and a half. Thousands of dollars in lost rent, and they can't do that. So I always tell people, go to legal aid. If you don't know, this is a complicated process for anybody, a provider, a tenant, anybody. I can go to someone on the street, I bet you, Alex and I, they wouldn't know half of what we just told y'all. People don't know this stuff. So please don't hesitate to contact legal aid. They have a housing department. They're lawyers. They eat this stuff up, you guys. So don't hesitate if you feel that the case warrants more input than what you, and knowledge and experience than what you are able to provide.
Yeah. And then just the last thing I just want to reiterate, I don't know if explicitly said this at the beginning, but if you are working with a member who either is in TCL or has a rental subsidy from one of our housing authorities, and you suspect that there is, damage or repairs that are not being addressed, please let us know or let the housing authority know, because even though for TCL, the annual inspections are suspended, that doesn't mean that we can't send an inspector out to do an emergency inspection. If there is, if you suspect that there's a bunch of minor failing items and it's clear that the landlord's not addressing that, we can still send an inspector out. We'll just figure out and coordinate with all parties on the tenant about how to, make sure that happens, during COVID, to make sure that everybody's safe and, no one's, we're doing our best to minimize, exposure risk. So just because TCL annual inspections are suspended does not mean that we can't inspect units that people are living in if you suspect that there's an issue that's going unresolved by a landlord. So that's our presentation on HQS inspections. I know it's a ton of information. I mean, honestly, you could do a day-long training about inspections and still not cover absolutely everything. If you have additional questions, please feel free to unmute yourself and ask. If you have specific individual cases that you want to discuss, just contact us offline so we can have those conversations individually. And thank you for joining us.
All right, I have one last question. On the previous slide, you showed the website for the HUD habitability checklist. I got part of it written down before you went to the following slide.
Sure.
I would just like to finish writing that down. Yeah, there it is.
And so, you can go to the HUDexchange.info. You can get all kinds of information directly from HUD about not just HQS, but other HUD required inspection protocols, et cetera. But again, like the habitability checklist, like I said, is just a good thing to, I think, use when you're looking at prospective units with tenants, just to kind of keep this stuff in mind, as you're going, if you're able to walk through a unit and it's empty, and I think another important thing to kind of think about as you're working with members, prospective tenants, ask yourself, one, would I live in this unit? Now, I want to make it clear that, choice is relative, right? And, where I might like to really live, I'll never be able to afford that. Okay, so choice is relative, we know. But I think it's important to listen to your instincts as well. If you go to see a unit on behalf of a member and it really doesn't look right and things are, unkempt or dirty. Now remember, cleanliness itself is not an HQS violation. But let's say you go to look at a unit and it's incredibly dirty, right? And let's say, I see like dead bugs or, that might be a sign that this landlord, the prospective landlord, might not be the most
conscientious.
They might not be the most empathetic. They might not be the most sympathetic. They may not be the kind of landlord that's going to respond. So listen to your instincts. I mean, I think we all have, because, all of us in our own personal lives, we have to navigate this as well. I mean, all of us have been renters at some point or might still be renters. I know my own personal experience, the last place that we were renting, there was a ton of condensation on the windows. It was an old house. There'd be all this mildew. And so, we basically convinced and told the landlord that they needed to give us a dehumidifier. And so we got one. Now, so I think it's important to listen to your own instincts and recall your own personal experiences about renting, and listen to that. Don't ignore that stuff. And, if you go into a prospective unit and you really are just like, I definitely can't see myself living here, And what about that unit is going to be beneficial to that member? If you feel like, okay, this neighborhood is not going to be beneficial, the unit itself is not going to be a great platform for that person to live independently and have a successful tenancy, it's important to listen to that. I think sometimes, again, because the backgrounds of a lot of the folks that we're serving, choice is very relative in the rental market, especially, if folks have lengthy criminal backgrounds, if that prospective landlord requires a credit check and folks don't have very good credit or they have very little credit. Obviously, that can make choices relative, right? And we don't necessarily have a lot of options. But I think it's still really important to ask, is this, based on what you see, does this feel like a place that's going to serve as a really good platform for somebody to live successfully, independently, and achieve, the goals that they want to achieve while they're living, in independent housing? So so always recommend that you really pay attention to your instincts about what you see in the unit.
And I always say, would I want to live here? And I will tell you that some of the people I've helped find housing for, they want to live in places that I wouldn't want to live in, but that's their choice. And I have to respect that choice. And
Right.
The one other thing I just want to bring up is that you see that habitability checklist. That's one form of inspection that you guys can do, is visual stuff and help people. Then we talked about the housing quality standard. There is one more. It's called type of inspection, uniform physical condition. And that is, well, it's the uniform physical condition standards. That is if there's a certain type of funding called HOME, HOME. Believe it or not, it stands for nothing. It's a HUD thing, but it's a type of funding called HOME. And if any of and a lot of our targeted units have HOME funds in them. We don't know that. We don't need to know that. But if ever you're wondering, like, okay, Alex and Natalie told us they only do such and such, but they might be seeming like they're doing a whole lot more, it's because there are HOME funds invested in that housing project, the development. They have a much higher standard.
Right. And that's going to be for all of those tax credit properties. So
Right.
What do I mean when I say tax credit? So the property development was financed using this federal program called the Low Income Housing Tax Credit. And so if a developer applies for those tax credits and gets it, it means that they're going to, a certain percentage of their units are subsidized and quote unquote affordable. But then that means it's also going to come with these inspection and safety protocols. But that's generally where that would be applicable. For folks in the private rental market,
not so much.
Yeah.
But the good thing about it, even though that is a higher standard, the good thing about it is those developers have to keep on top of everything.
yes.
So typically there aren't a whole lot of issues in tax credit units. There just aren't, because they've got, the developers have to keep up with it.
And so we've opened this training up to not only our providers, but we've opened it up to like the COCs as well. So some of our people that might be on the call you're using rapid rehousing dollars to get your people into housing. If you have rapid rehousing dollars, you only need the habitability checklist. So it just depends which funding stream, depends on which housing checklist you use. But for most of our TCLI and subsidized that Natalie and Alex do, you want the HQS, the housing.
Yeah, it'll be a requirement. Yep.
Yes, but this one I think is the checklist invaluable for in between periods. I would say use it regularly if you have a concern, especially if you have an individual who is might be going into crisis. You want to be able, and you want to get into that house to make sure it's safe for them and for their neighbors. You can use that habitability checklist.
And hopefully you guys have picked up some stuff. If any of you are renters, hopefully you've picked up some information that will be helpful to you also in your own personal lives.
Yeah, and sorry, I know we've gone we've gone a couple minutes over, so really thank you to everybody for your time. Again, if you have other questions that come up, please, you have our contact information. Please feel free to contact us. So yeah, thank you for your time.
Yeah, thank
Thanks,
you.
guys.
And next week
Have a good
we
day.
have,
Thanks for the good
Yep.
training. Thanks for a good training.
yep,
You're welcome.
another training next week. So we'd love for you to join us. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
You're
Take care.
welcome. Enjoy the rest of your week.
You too.
Thanks, Renata.